the LGBT community is once again the target of conservative Orwellian legislation. In October, Alberta's UCP government introduced 3 new pieces of legislation that target trans youth. We're going to discuss 2 of those bills now. Before that, though, I want to share with you this scientific article that looks into suicidal tendencies of trans youth. This is the article, Suicidality Amongst Transgender Youth, which was published in March of 2020. In the abstract, it starts with, data indicates that 82% of transgender individuals have considered killing themselves, and 40% have attempted suicide, with suicidality highest amongst transgender youth. I also want to share these quotes from the abstract. Interpersonal microaggressions made a unique, statistically significant contribution to a lifetime suicide attempts, and emotional neglect by family approach significance. School belonging, emotional neglect by family, and internalized stealth stigma made a unique, statistically significant contribution to past 6 months suicidality. Bill 26, which modifies the Health Status Amendment Act, seeks to ban the use of hormone therapy for the treatment of gender dysphoria, would ban the use of puberty blockers for minors, and would ban any cosmetic surgery for the purposes of treating gender dysphoria. Let's compare that with what the Conservative Party says about the bill. So, preserving choices for children and youth. Minors who identify as transgender often grapple with complex feelings and emotions, and these policies would support them as they enter adulthood. This is incongruent with reality and their own arguments for a previous bill from my previous video discussing trans athletes in women's sports. So they argue that someone who has gone through male puberty should not be allowed to participate in women's sports, while at the same time banning the very treatment that would equalize the playing field on women's sports teams. And you might argue, if you've read the bill, that the bill still allows for the use of puberty blockers if you are 16 to 17 years old. There's only one slight, tiny little problem with that, and that is puberty typically ends when you're 16 or 17. So by the time you have access to puberty blockers, you've already gone through the entirety or the majority of puberty. This is something that I talked about in my previous video, which is this idea of false equity, where one party seeks to implement unrealistic barriers that might seem equitable on the surface, but when you actually dig into it and look into it, that equity falls away and it becomes an insurmountable barrier for the minority. However, by far, the worst bill out of the 3 is Bill 27, which is an amendment to the Education Amendment Act. The Education Amendment Act, or how they intend to change it, would force schools and teachers to inform parents if a child wants to use a different name or pronoun. It also changes the sex ed policies to be an opt-in program instead of an opt-out program. However, we're mostly focused on trans youth right now, and if you're interested, I can make a video on the sex education policies in Alberta schools. So this is where that Orwellian part comes in. So the Conservatives often use subversive language to make you think that what they're doing is okay, when in fact it isn't. Let me give you an example. This is for the consent and notification of a child's preferred name to their parent or guardian. It starts, the top priority of Alberta's government is that every student feels welcomed, cared for, and respected while at school. Let's look into the bill and see how the bill actually affects trans youth. So, the bill states, a teacher, teacher leader, or other school staff member shall not use a new preferred name or pronoun when referring to a student in school until the student's parent is notified and unless the parent consents is obtained. So let's break this down. As a parent, You are not entitled to know every aspect of your child's life. You aren't entitled to know who they sit with at lunch. You aren't entitled to know if they are going on a date with someone. You aren't entitled to know their sexuality, and you shouldn't be entitled to know whether or not they want to change their name or their pronouns at school. And to those parents out there who are supportive and say something like, I would still support my kids, I just want to know. Speaking from my own experience, it's not about you. And this is the most important and dangerous part of Bill 27, where notifying the student's parent or seeking the parent's consent is reasonably expected to cause emotional or psychological harm to the student, or the student requests access to assistance, the board shall ensure that the student is provided with counseling or other assistance before notifying the student's parents. You'll notice the most important part is that they've excluded physical harm from this statement. I want to take a look at this article, LGBTQ2 plus youth and gender-based violence report. This is from Action Canada for Sexual Health and Rights, and it dives into the LGBT community, specifically how LGBTQ plus youth are discriminated against and how it impacts their lives. One stat that I want to share with you from this article is that approximately 20 to 40% of homeless youth identify as part of the LGBT community. But what's really important about this article and what ties back into Bill 27 is this section: lack of safety in family contexts. Many participants highlighted problems in familial contexts, particularly with regards to unaccepting or unsafe homes and the impact of family violence. Participants emphasized the scope and depth of family violence, including physical abuse, isolation, and neglect. Participants emphasized the negative impact of living in homes where LGBTQ2 plus identities are implicitly or explicitly unwelcomed, where families are able to act as gatekeepers, preventing access to health and social services, and the homelessness, too, often resulting from familial rejection. Participants particularly emphasized the difficulty of existing in unaccepting homes, having to hide their LGBTQ2 plus identities and remain in the closet in order to maintain familial relationships, or due to their dependency on parental resources. Many participants highlighted the dependent relationship between many LGBTQ2 plus youth and their parents, and the capacity of unaccepting parents to prevent access to medical, health, and social services, particularly in the case of trans young people seeking access to transition-related health care. Participants emphasized the violence of family rejection and expulsion from parental homes. Of particular note, participants highlighted the impact of health and well-being, self-esteem, and communities resulted from unstable housing. And these are quotes from children who participated in this study. It's hard for me to say, as I've never been out in my suburban community growing up, largely due to many unspoken rules, that it was not okay to be queer, and having parents coming from a culture that are unlikely to meet my coming out with acceptance, but rather alienation, it felt safer to pretend to be straight, although I have no doubt that if I was more open about it, I would have faced more harassment and bullying. Young adults, because they are often still dependent on their families for food, shelter, finance, and access to healthcare, can find themselves in a position where their family will actively stand in the way of young adults' ability to transition and or threaten to kick the youth out should they pursue transition. There is not enough resources for youth to go and get help, especially in rural communities. Oftentimes, youth are unable to access those resources, even if they are provided, due to it being unsafe or being afraid to. Oftentimes, parental consent is needed to access these resources, which can be risky if the parents are the assailants. So just as a reminder, nearly 80% of transgender youth have had suicidal thoughts, and 40% have tried to kill themselves. Up to 40% of homeless youth are part of the LGBTQ plus community. Our LGBT youth, they face discrimination in schools. They face being kicked out of homes. So what do the UCP bills actually do? They prevent our kids from playing sports, which is great for their mental health. It prevents them from getting access to the medical treatment that they need. And it exposes kids to further violence by outing them to potentially unaccepting parents. No matter how they choose to phrase it, their actions are very clear. These bills are not about keeping kids safe. It's about codifying into law a system that hates them and ensuring that the suicide rate only goes up. This was part 2. If you want to learn more about how the Fairness and Safety in Sport Act targets some 350 kids, click here. If you like this content, please like below and subscribe.